Hey everyone, welcome to our conversation with Cory today. Cory, your Archdisciplinary Research Center is your main project. It's a non-for-profit organization, and you're advocating for support of individuals and groups and institutions with big picture theories of everything. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, okay. Well, Archdisciplinary Research Center is an organization that's primarily focused on research and application of big picture theory of everything, unification, meta-theoretical frameworks. And I guess that's sort of like the nutshell version of our organization.
Yeah, it's super cool. So you have this encyclopedia of these theories, and it's like you've done this research around all these different theories of everything, and part of your project is to try and find the commonalities, the kind of what you call arches, these pieces of the theories which are common between them all. Yeah, I'm really curious to how you got interested in that approach and like what brought you to this place of starting up this foundation.
Yeah, so I suppose every time that that question comes up, like it always comes out of me differently. So I guess I'm not sure exactly how it's going to come out of me today. Um, so like back when I was like late teens, I was interested in comparative religion, and and then I found my way into reading Carl Jung's work. So late teens, early 20s, I basically read through like all of his work, and in reading Jung's work, that turned me on to comparative philosophy and comparative psychology. And then, from those, then I got interested in science, going back. I guess the way it went was, there was this notion of like archetypes in Jung's work. And his archetypes they had to do with like individuals and our relationship with other people around us in society. And for him, archetypes were sort of like a kind of an instinct, like it autonomously organizes our experience. And we can find this similarly across cultures. And then people have similar imagery, motifs in their myths and religions for how these things sort of come out of the unconscious and take expression in different ways. And so I asked a question, well, could there be other kinds of archetypes in nature? And so this led me to just going to the library every day. I was lucky enough to work a job where I worked doubles on the weekends, and then I just have all day to myself. So I'd spend, the first part of the day up at the library, and then in the evenings, sort of collating my work at coffee shops. But I basically did like a survey across different domains of human knowing and doing, and I found that there were patterns in across these different domains. And so like earlier on, I was already thinking about, I was aware of the fact that there were people historically who had big picture frameworks, like for example, Immanuel Kant and Hegel. But I sort of like compartmentalized them because I wanted to see what I could come up with myself. And I did. Eventually I found patterns, and I created a framework called the spectrum of human imagination. And at the time I was aware of like historical analogs, but I wasn't aware of like contemporary stuff, right? Because like I was primarily in encyclopedias and what books were available at the library, and then finding associations and ordering books that way. So I wasn't aware of the fact that Ken Wilber had written a book called, what was it? The Spectrum of Consciousness. And I find it interesting because like individuals who find their way into the space will generally have like very they'll go through like similar sequence, right? Like I remember earlier on thinking to myself that there are a lot of different ways that people make sense of the world, but they all seem to have part of the truth, but none of them quite has all of the truth. And nobody is entirely wrong. And then I would find later that Wilbur would write very, very similarly in like his thinking. And then in talking with other people, I found this to be a similar case as well. So yeah, like Spectrum of Human Imagination was sort of like my first framework that brought together universal classes. I guess it's kind of a bit long-winded. I guess since this is an interview, I'll probably maybe go into some of the details here. Yeah, so like as I was writing a book about it, I would write emails off and inquire people in the world who had expertise in different areas, and a lot of people wouldn't respond, but every once in a while somebody would. And one individual that did respond was Sarah Nora Ross. So like as I was getting towards the end of the book, that's when I sort of got to the point where I was like, okay, I kind of have my own framework here. And now I feel comfortable like looking into other frameworks that other people have and looking at what the commonalities and differences are between what I came up with and what other people came up with. And then I also realized that my framework was architectural. So it had to do with what we might associate with like big history classes. So, you have like, okay, so for example, like there's a notion of spirit, but then different cultures, different religions will have different renditions of it. And then in science, they'll associate it with energy. And they have very, very different approaches, different methodologies for understanding it, different backgrounds, which they're drawing from to construct their ideas. But there's recurring characteristics that repeat again and again. So the human imagination model was basically things like energy and form, matter, organics, and psyche, and so on. And I realized the way that I was sort of organizing, it was very architectural, it was very structural, like what is, not how things change. And so I was thinking if I write another book, I would probably do a comparative analysis of processes. And so I started looking into process theories online. I found my way into developmental psychology, and then I found my way to Wilber. And when I was looking at Wilber's stuff, I noticed that there were some errors that he made. And this isn't I'm not trying to poke at integral theory here. It's just to say that when he was comparing stage theories, I noticed that there were some discrepancies. So I started looking online to find if other people had noticed the same thing. And it was Sarah Ross, who I found. And she was a PhD in political science and psychology. And she worked with Michael Commons, who was a Harvard professor of developmental psychology. And he's retired now. And but at the time, he was teaching and he was working, and he had Sarah had written a paper about how Wilber had misrepresented hierarchical complexity. And so I asked her if they had like a table that did correspondences and fixed it. And so she sent an email to Michael, and he sent me a table, and it resolved all the issues that I had. And so through them, they're like, well, where are you? What are you doing? And I'm like, well, I kind of live out in the sticks in the middle of nowhere, kind of doing this thing all by myself. And so they decided I belonged in academia. And I would say they opened doors, but I still had to get in on my own merit. And I ended up doing a master's in social science and informatics. And so when I did my master's, a big part of what my emphasis was, and now I'm kind of coming back to answering your question about like how I kind of came to where I am now. When I was working on my thesis, I decided to do that comparison, right, of taking like architectures and processes and relating them. And this led me down the lineage of the history of universal computability, which is to say that, so like in architectural representations of reality, there are certain properties that repeat again and again in the way that people construct ideas, but also in process theories, people have a similar pattern for like how they organize their ideas and they construct their frameworks. So I'm like, how is it that, I can build a architectural model, but then Commons over here and other people have process models, but we're following the same cognitive procedure in generating the ideas. And yeah, this led to the history of like computability, what I now term like universal computability, which is that you have you have like static, dynamic, and multidynamic, or like entities, relations, and systems. And in the architectural case, the entities, relations, and systems are represented very ontologically. They're represented very structurally. And on the process side, their variables are actions and relationships between actions and action systems. And so this universal computational, these properties, these characteristics, I realized that this was of a higher order of behavioral complexity than what I needed to construct my framework and what Commons and other people needed to construct their process frameworks. And so, like, after my master's, I wanted to study abroad, and I managed to get into Jyväskylä University, and that's like a whole story in itself. But the main thing is that the emphasis of my studies was to synthesize architectural approach and the process approach. And I noticed that other big picture frameworks would fall into like different categories that in the way that they would construct their frameworks. So this wasn't just like with architectures and processes, but this was with other things as well. And I was in conversation with Daniel Quartz and Johan Ranefers. They were friends before I met them, but we started having conversations, and we decided that we should probably like create some sort of a research organization to do this sort of like comparative analysis. But at the time, Daniel was just starting to write like his first Hansi book on metamodernism, and I was just starting my PhD program. So we decided to put it off until we got a little bit further along. And so, yeah, like eventually ended up back in the US. And then I was in a situation where I could decide kind of like what I wanted to do. And so, yeah, I decided to sort of spearhead the Archdisciplinary Research Center. So there's folks who had been doing comparative analysis and synthesizing big picture frameworks, but there wasn't anyone who had created sort of like a formal science out of it. We have like disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. You know, disciplinarity, people are one particular domain, they're anchored in that domain. They might borrow from other domains or other disciplines, but they always stay anchored in that one. And the interdisciplinarity, of course, that's when a person releases their anchor from being just in one discipline, and then they work across two or more disciplines to problem solve, to try and understand how things work and come up with better practices for dealing with whatever that is. And of course, like transdisciplinarity is when the breadth of disciplines, people sort of wrap their arms around all of it. And then they say, okay, well, we need to actually look at everything we know across our species to problem solve. And so archdisciplinarity follows from this. It's not an ideology, it's a scope of inquiry. In the same way that disciplinarity would focus on one domain, interdisciplinarity on a couple, transdisciplinarity wraps its arms around everything. We take the approaches that wrap their arms around everything as our units of analysis, and then we do comparisons between them. And so, yeah, like I, had inquired some folks, seeing who else might be interested, and surprisingly, pretty much almost everybody that I inquired about it was interested in joining the organization. So yeah, we started the organization, like 2 years ago, I think is like when we went public.
No, it's great. It's awesome to hear your backstory around that. It sounds like you, really set yourself up from a young age with your interest in comparative religion and this journey through kind of more broader and bigger scopes of knowledge and inquiry. And it feels like to come up with a theory of everything in itself requires a transdisciplinary approach and this broad scope of knowledge. But then to compare theories of everything is like another even bigger step, because you have to understand the scope of knowledge of each theory in themselves and how they relate. So yeah, it just feels like this really huge undertaking, and that it's cool that you have a team of friends and people that you trust to be able to meet you there and to follow you with that journey. Yeah, really, really awesome stuff. And interestingly, where I met you was through the Metamodernism community on Facebook. And in your book, you talk about Archmodernity. Could you talk a little bit more about the possible transition from all the way back from modernity through to what Archmodernity might look like?
Yeah. Okay. So there's, first I'll sort of like contextualize a little bit. So there's different languages that people use to describe like development. And before I was talking about process theories and I was talking about like developmental psychology, like I think I mentioned it. But there's different languages, different jargon that people use to put into words how individuals in societies advance. And so in the Foundations of Archdisciplinarity book, in the first half of it, it's divided into scopes of inquiry, scales of theory, and then like stages of social development. And so I've talked a little bit about scopes of inquiry, with the disciplinary language. And we can also talk about like scales of theory that follow along with those different scopes of inquiry. And I'll just kind of run through them quick, which is that there's like theories, and then there's meta theories, which are theories about other theories. And then there's integrative or unification meta theories. And those are when we get to the transdisciplinary scope. And then there's arch theories, and then the arch theories are associated with that archdisciplinary scope. And similarly, there's a similar approximation with stages of individual and sociocultural development. And the way it goes is, different people divide it up in different ways. And I think that all those ways have different validity. The way that we do it in the book is basically to say that there's pre-modern, modern, postmodern, metamodern, and then archmodern. So pre-modern basically is like very traditional religiosity approaches. So people's sensibility about the world is determined by their religious beliefs. So they don't need to have like any evidence per se for a belief. They just have their faith, and then they usually draw their truths from whatever their holy text is or whatever their religious practices are. With modernity, this introduces like empiricism. So people get to a point where they say, okay, so our religious way of making sense of things, that's all fine and good. But there are some things about the natural world that it isn't showing us. Like it doesn't show us a methodology for how to know that. And in order for us to enrich our lives and understand the world around us better, there are other things that we can learn. And then we can follow a particular procedure for how to know about that world and how to verify that things are true. So I can follow a method, and then I can keep track of everything as I like what my original idea was, like my hypothesis, and then I can run through a sequence of actions and get an outcome and record that. And I can give it to other people, and then they can do the same thing themselves, see if they get the same outcome. And then if we have differences, then we can have a conversation about it. So this is the basis of science. Modernity is about primarily about science and rationality. So from modernity comes postmodernity, because what happens is that there are actually different methodologies that we can follow. And when we follow those different methodologies, we arrive at different kinds of conclusions. So postmodernists have a sort of a relativism perspective, which says, well, you follow your methodology, I follow mine, we come to different conclusions, but how do we decide on like who's actually right? Because sometimes we come to very opposite conclusions. And so, there's this notion of like structuralism, that everything is constructed, and even our ideas about how we form methodologies are constructed. And then it sort of like reaches a ceiling where everything is just relative. And anyone can be and do anything that they want. Nobody can really argue them for their way of thinking and doing, because there's no there's no basis to make have a consensus. So with what happens with metamodernism, metamodern sensibilities basically says, well, wait a minute, there's all these different ways of knowing and doing, but we can actually fit them together. We can actually systematize them. And then it turns out that they actually all do fit together, and they represent different ways of being a person. And then we can carry forward some of the pre-modern stuff, some of the modern stuff, and some of the postmodern stuff. And when we combine that all together, we get a new kind of a sensibility that understands that people are actually going through processes. Now we have several different, individual and social development stages that we can reflect on. And so we can get a trajectory, like where we came from and where we're going. So how this answers the question of archmodernism, first I would say that archdisciplinarity is very new. So there have been people who have been doing archdisciplinary practice without there yet being a term and definition for it. And even now, like in our organization, in for example, the Institute of Applied Metatheory, I would say they're doing like archdisciplinary stuff. But we don't have a lot of examples to draw on to say a whole lot about what it is, because it's basically like me and people that I know talking about ourselves. There's not, the group of people who are doing it all kind of know each other in most cases. So there isn't sort of like an objective, reflective point that we can look at to assess. And then therefore it becomes sort of like, it can be a little bit biased, right? Because then, we're saying things about our own selves and observations we're making on our own. And then we haven't yet gotten to the point where you can sort of like verify it, like from other perspectives, people developing other frameworks in the same space for making sense of what's going on to get that comparative analysis. But I would say that if we look at like the historical like periods in what happens is that there's this similar repetition of this pattern. So like earlier on, like I was talking about universal computability, where you have like entities, relationships, and systems. So like a system then becomes a new entity, and then the entity has relationships with other entities, and then the relationships between them becomes a system, that becomes a new entity. So we could think about that like in terms of the behavioral complexity of development, where when we're going from one stage to the next, we're following this procedure and becoming more complex in our thinking. And so, going to like the post-modernity thing, for example. So you get all these different ways of being and doing in the world. So that would be the entities. But then you realize that they can all be related to each other. And then you can systematize it and you get to the metamodern. So we could say something similar going from the metamodern to the archmodern. So you have different versions of metamodernism. So like some people think about it as like artistic and cultural. Other people think about it in the context of like spirituality. Other people think about it in the context of like psychology. Other people are more social studies oriented in terms of how they're making sense of it. So the archmodern thing says, okay, well then now let's look across all these different ways that people take approaches, that the different kinds of sensibilities people have in the way that they're experiencing the world from these different metamodern perspectives, and then let's relate them to each other, and then let's systematize them together to find what they share in common, in the same way that we would say, well, there's these big picture theory of everything frameworks. Let's look across each of these and relate them, and then systematize to see what they all share in common. So I think we're sort of like in a transitional process. But if I were to make like a guess, and it's only a guess, it would, and a lot of this is written in the Foundations book, which is that I think a lot of it has to do with people breaking down the boundaries between their theory of everything approaches that they have. So like there's this situation historically where people who, they put their blood, sweat, and tears into building a framework that can unify everything humanity understands, whether that's in a specific domain or to cross domains. And then all of a sudden you get other people who also put their blood, sweat, and tears. And I think that it can feel a little bit competitive between people, because they're trying to create an audience, but then there's other people who are trying to create their own audiences. So I think I think archmodernism would be like this sort of breakthrough, like something that we've done in the organization, something I see in the Institute of Applied Meta Theory doing. There's this sort of like breaking through to say, okay, so we all have like our theory of everything frameworks. We should be working together instead of competing for audiences, right? Like we should be looking for what we share in common and then looking about how we can apply our commonality to solving real world problems instead of having endless armchair debates, arguing about like whose framework is right and wrong and, you know, the causality of one error or another. Like, I think no matter how many stacks of complexity a person goes, we're always going to have errors. We're always going to make mistakes. I think from what I observe, people usually place emphasis on what is in common across the frameworks and then build mutuality on those. And then after mutuality is established, then you can have those conversations because now you've earned the right to have the more difficult conversations and people know that the person who's challenging them means well, right? They're not just trying to replace their framework with another. They're trying to help update the framework so it can be the best framework that it can be.
Yeah, there's this real sense of this yes and, right? Like there's a because it's another thing that I've discovered that we have in common is that we're both part of Kurt Mungel's Theories of Everything Discord server, where there's a similar project to discover the requirements of a theory of everything. And I know that's a big part of your work as well, right? The arches are these like commonalities between theories of everything.
Yeah, so one of the chapters in the book on Archdisciplinary Research actually gives an outline of some of the properties that would constitute a theory of everything. And I'm just kind of saying off the top. I don't have the best memory. I'll just say off the top of my head from what I recall. In order for something to be considered a theory of everything, it has to, so actually breaks down into like, I would say like two different categories. So you have theories of everything that are domain specific, and then there are theories of everything that are cross-domain. So theories of everything that are domain specific would be like Hawking's theory of everything of material reality, right? So he's trying to explain how it all works together. An example of like in the domain of life would be like Miller's living systems. So he has aggregated all the paradigms and then he's fit them all together into all the building blocks of life and like how it all relates to each other. But there's also like theories of everything that are cross-domain. And then they basically take everything we know about each of these, each of the domains, however they divide it up, and then they try and fit them all together into some sort of coherent framework. So I would say that it has to do with like integrating everything within a given scope in the context of that, whatever their scope is. Like I would say like for the two examples I gave for domain specific, I would generally classify them as like meta-theoretical. Like they're unifications, but they're not at the same scope and scale as something like integral theory or like Henrique's unified theory of knowledge, right? Where he accounts for all of the domains and he describes a multiplicity of paradigms and how they can be systematized to make sense of what's going on in each domain and then relates across the domains. So another way of dividing it up would be to say that they have to, before I was talking about architectures and processes. So one of the arches is called integrative levels. And that means that in general, what we found for theories of everything is that they almost always have some account of building blocks of nature. So whether that's in one domain or it's across domains, or they're taking the domains themselves and putting them into levels. And then each one has its sort of like sub-levels. So that generally falls into like two categories where there's like theories of everything that are architectural, ontological, and structural, like defining what exists in the universe. And then there's process models. And then those describe how things happen, the way that things transform from one thing into another across domains. So theories of everything usually will fit into one of those two categories. Another thing that I would make a distinction about with theories of everything is the magnitude of behavioral complexity that a person has in constructing their framework. So just thinking what framework I would want to use to put this in context. Well, I'll just say it like this. So there's a difference between having a theory of everything that treats universal classes as generalizations, as opposed to a framework that fully accounts for the paradigms, can describe their principles and how they apply to abstract systems about concrete real world things. So historically, people would have theories of everything, like, for example, like in Hermetic alchemy, they would draw these elaborate diagrams, and then they would have like these different classes of reality. But they wouldn't give high level specificity about the interiority of the mechanisms of what's going on, right? So another distinction I would make is the magnitude of behavioral complexity a person is using to construct the framework. And then of course I would also include like calculatory. There are fewer cases where people have a theory of everything that accounts for architectures and processes both, and shows how they are interrelated to calculate all the complexities that exist in a given domain or across domains. And so in general, they'll fall into one of those categories.
Another way that I've heard those categories described before is kind of like a grand unification theory, kind of like the specifics around physics and the missing elements of physical theories. And they're usually kind of maybe the domain specific theories you're talking about. And then, a theory that can describe both the interface between kind of the fundamental stuff of existence, whether that's framed as in the theory, and the unfolding of that into everyday world and how it might emerge as political systems or even psychology or minds. Those kind of theories feel a lot more rare in that they cover both the scope of the grand unification theory and the second kind of theory that you mentioned. And then there's also another kind of framing that I like, where we've got this the logos and the mythos of the theory. The kind of the alchemist's exploration of the theory is kind of like this mythos. It's pointing to something symbolically, and there's a kind of necessity of that, in that it's the way that we relate to the information on a personal experiential level. And then there's the logos, which is the kind of more specific telling of the dynamics and the interplay between whatever the framework is telling. So yeah, kind of like those framings as well.
Yeah, I like that. The sort of natural inclination of my brain is to say, so like each one of those lenses reveals a very valuable rendition of reality, but then we can also relate them to each other, and we can systematize them, and then we get a more robust, penetrating understanding. And I would also say that those things you're talking about, I think they also relate to different orientations for how we use our brains, right? So like if we're talking about logos, could we correspond that with like prefrontal cortex, like logical related stuff, or like eros we could associate with like affect, what is it, like the amygdala, like the affect, emotional, like sensory, sort of experience.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about the first, you mentioned during when you're telling us about your backstory, that you first reached out to some of these people while you were writing a book. Was it The Spark of Human Imagination? Is that what it was called? I think I missed the first half of the time.
Yeah, it was The Spectrum of Human Imagination.
Spectrum, okay. Could you tell us a bit more about what was that about?
All right, so first I'll say The Spectrum of Human Imagination I wrote about in my master's thesis, which was entitled A Fractal Phase Calculus for Recursive Architectonic Computability, which is just like a really really complicated way of saying understanding repeating universal processes that happen in human understanding. The spectrum of human imagination, the way that I approached it was like a binomial nomenclature of different categories of human experience. And so I had this it was this huge radial map. I think the online table is just like a APA sort of table, like gigantic table. But there's like hundreds of categories in it, and they all use like Latin terminology. So trying to communicate it to people to say, well, take the analog of like how we have the taxonomy of the kingdoms of life, and how we have like Latin nomenclature we use to describe different like categories within categories. We can apply that same idea to all the categories of the capacity for humans to imagine things. The problem with the framework is that it was combinatorial explosion, like everywhere. And for any given class, then there was like relating that class to other classes. And then when you add those, then you can come up with new combinations of terminology. And while there's like an algorithm to generating the language, it was just not a viable means of communication. And it was very difficult to communicate the ideas to people that I would talk to. Also, when I was doing my PhD, so what happened was basically the spectrum of human imagination represented like architectural classes. And then I sort of just carried all of that over. And then I did a pretty broad study on universal process classes. And then I sort of created a framework that's about the same level of behavioral complexity, and then I combined them. And then that framework is called architectonic simulation, which is it's mentioned in the Foundations book, but it's not the focus of the Foundations book. That's architectonic simulation is my arch theory, my personal arch theory. So spectrum of human imagination got absorbed into that framework. I went from being transdisciplinary into being archdisciplinary. And that meant having a universal architectural framework and universal process framework that were both transdisciplinary, and then converging them together along their shared arches to create an arch theory.
That first project almost sounds like a framework for training in AI, or like creating imagination in some kind of simulated space. Like the complexity of it sounds, too hard to imagine or to communicate, but maybe a computer could do that work.
Actually, like on the ARC website, we have a page up for our AGI research group. And we're actually doing that. We're taking archdisciplinary approach to attempting to solve for artificial general intelligence. Although in our internal conversations, we've kind of agreed that maybe calling it artificial general intelligence isn't the best term. It might just be better to just call it a simulator, because it starts with simulating universal rules that I would propose underpin how reality works. And then from that, you sort of like can, in some sense, procedurally generate upwards. And then from the classes that come out of it, then you can sort of like create sub-simulations of sentient entities from those classes. So it's the same as saying, like, I mean, I'm not going to say one way or another, like if God is real, but if we were to say that there was a God and we look at the way the universe is, it's like, oh, first we make the universe and then we'll make creatures inside the universe that follow similar rules, but we're going to put constraints on it that are specific to its kind. And so that's kind of how we're thinking about it. But we're literally programming arches, their relations and their systematization, and then building universal classes from that systematization. And I can't really talk about the math, because we have like internal agreements and things like that. But what I can say is that it's really interesting working on it, because in writing code, it's like so in the Foundations of Archdisciplinarity book, we have like a section on arches, and the section on arches, it's like a repeating pattern how things are laid out, where there will be like an image, like a graphical representation of the arch, and then there will be like a brief synopsis explanation, and then on the next page, like on the right-hand side, then will be theorems and axioms and corollaries. And so in programming, it's really, really interesting to me, because it's like either an axiom is going to work or it's not going to work. Like when you convert it into mathematical statement and then you're, running a value through it, like either it's going to do what it's supposed to do or it's not. And I really, really like that. Like, there's like the hard mathematical testing of ideas, and the hard mathematical testing of the relationship between ideas. So we can say it in English, I can say it, in words, and it can sound just fine by another person. But when we convert this into code and we run it, does it work? And I'm happy to say that it does, as far as we've gotten so far. So yeah, if people are interested in learning a little bit about what we're doing on the arc.voyage website, there's a link in there in the menu bar. You can go down to AGI Research, and we have it's like a page or two sort of like overview of the general ideas that are behind what we're doing.
One thing I'm really curious about this particular project is its use of arches. So my understanding of arches is that they're kind of like archetypes. They're kind of necessary inherent components, but in some sense they're not specific. Like they're like rules without particular flavors, in the same way that archetype is like the sovereign can look like many different kings and queens and leaders of tribes or whatever. So I'm curious how you go about specifying these arches in this, maybe in particular with this AGI project.
So first of all, it's a question of language. So we use different parts of our brains for different purposes, and different parts of our brains have different qualia. So like our temporal lobes process language, and like our hind lobes processes like visual spatial representation. Our temporal lobes can't process spatial temporal stuff. Brain modules are specifically for just linguistic related things, and our hind lobes are just for that purpose, and other parts of our brain and so on. Like in talking about language, in meta languages, what people do is they attempt to, through that particular language, apply it to itself to derive some properties that hold true across what that domain is capable of. So like in meta logic, people try and come up with like different orders of logic, right? Like they try and organize like the integrative levels of the properties that get inherited into different levels of abstraction, from the concrete thing in upwards different levels of like self-reflection. And so meta languages like meta logic and meta linguistics and meta mathematics, they are languages that are attempting to define the overall Rulliad space of what is possible for that particular domain of knowing and experiencing things. So when programming arches, if a person uses only one of those meta languages to try and program, you run into limitations, because arches represent universal properties that hold across any given domain at any scale. And if we have time, I'd like to talk about universal problem solving a little bit as well. So like if one were to try and program arches using meta logic, then you run into a problem, because everything becomes a logic. Everything becomes a logical. And even though you're able to describe universal properties of nature through logic, everything takes on the characteristic of logic. And not everything is perfectly convertible over to other capabilities of our brains and our bodies. So what one has to do is look across the meta languages and basically construct theorems and axioms for what they share in common, and then write the code based on that. So this is going from like meta language to arch language. And the thing with arch language is that you can't say it because we run out of brain. So you have to downward assimilate it into logic or mathematics or linguistics in order to communicate it. But then the person who receives it has to upward assimilate it back to understand that those characteristics hold for all domains of knowing, all kinds of languages and meta languages. So to answer the question, it's basically coming up with a way to program arch language that can take different meta languages so that you can do the language conversion, and also respect where the boundaries are, where you can't carry something over properly. I'll give you an example to try and like ground it in something that's directly experiential. So like if you look at like the color red and you see it, you have the experience of the color red, but you can't convert that into a logical statement. You can say the color red in logic. You can have like a logical statement that takes color red, but the logical statement itself can't be red. It's like it's not the right brain material to do it. Similarly with the number 3, like I'd say the number 3 or the number 4, you don't have like a specific emotion for the number 3. Unless you have like synesthesia and like things are wired wrong in your brain, and so things get associated in a way that isn't medically normal. This is what I mean by that.
Yeah, there's a sense that maybe that the AGI would need to have the capacity to interpret a piece of data like a 3 or a red, in whether it's in logic or whatever form it comes in multiple different ways, in order to understand it in that kind of archdisciplinary space. It sounds a complicated thing to make.
Yeah, there's like a separating out. Like you have to separate out like arch language defining meta language, and then meta languages defining languages, and then languages are defining like concrete real world things to get to high enough level of language understanding so that you can do conversions across different meta languages and across their languages, and understand where it's appropriate to make one-to-one equivalences and where there are places that are not correct to do those equivalences. And it sounds abstract when I'm saying it, but you can get very, very specific on like what those things are and the reasons why that's the case.
A little while ago, you mentioned a term which was Rulliad space, which, brought up a question I have already written down, which is in the Archdisciplinary Foundations text, you have a definition of the Rulliad in one of the tables, which is the entangled limit of everything that is computationally possible, result of following all possible computational rules in all possible ways as possibility space. I was kind of wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on how you conceive of this possibility space. Does that have ontological or metaphysical significance? Is that just a conceptual abstraction? How would you characterize that?
I think that's a really, really good question, and I would like to know the answer to that question myself. I try and not make a lot of like metaphysical claims that I can't ground in something empirical as much as possible. But I also understand that there are things in the universe that are intrinsically intangible and therefore are not subject to scientific investigation. I think with Rulliad, we're talking about something related to Peirce's like continuum, where you there's this sort of like one example I like to give is like toasters. Like every person who's born on the face of the planet, insofar as they have medically normal like brain physiology, has the capacity to imagine a toaster. the universe intrinsically had the capacity for toasters to exist in the universe. And I think that's a very, very fascinating. It's a very fascinating idea that all the possibilities of anything that could ever possibly happen pre-exist as a possibility with which can be brought out of latency under the right conditions. And I think Rulliad is related to this in that we account for all the possible states and transformations on some set of conditions in a given scope for what can happen in a given system. And I think like Wolfram's notion of it, so pretty much everything that you read in the book, I would hope is, and it's intended to be, in alignment with Wolfram's notion. Like we borrow the word from him, we cite him multiple times in the book. We're saying that the Rulliad, as Wolfram describes it, is an arch. But then we can also sort of like, maybe we make like some proposals how we could maybe like add some things to it, which is like, well, what extent of Rulliad are we talking about? You know, like, are we talking about conditions within a given, like a smaller system, or we can talk about it in his context, like the entire universe. So I think that there's like a measurability of the scope of a Rulliad that we can talk about. But as for like metaphysical claims, I make the observation of Rulliad. The causality for Rulliad to exist in the universe, you know, where nothingness meets suchness, where possibility meets actuality. All I can do is just make observations on it, report the observations for other people to take, and then they can see if those theorems, as they're described in the book, also apply to other things in their own experience, in whatever other experiments they want to run with it.
In my experience, a lot of unifying frameworks position themselves as theories of metaphysics. I'm curious if because you probably have a significantly more comprehensive knowledge of these kinds of theories than I do, and I'm curious whether you would agree with that characterization and how you would think of what the reference of the term metaphysics is. And I'm also curious, do you have a favorite unifying framework out of all the ones that you've surveyed in your studies?
Okay, so yeah, I would say that I wouldn't say all of them, but I would say many of them have some metaphysical angle, which makes sense because the framing of reality having a metaphysical component to it is part of human knowledge. Frameworks that are attempting to aggregate all human understanding will have a tendency to aggregate something about it. But it really just depends on where the author comes from, because like if you have an author who, you know, went to school for physics and they're formally trained in physics with physicists and they're surrounded by people who are atheists and that is the status quo, then chances are they'll probably leave it out. And if they do include it, then yeah, there's some interesting ideas that can come out of that. I think like Penrose, for example, I'm not sure if I'm entirely fresh on like his approach, but I also think it's healthy to consider possibilities of how metaphysics can relate to big picture frameworks. In my arch theory of architectonic simulation, I have classes that relate to metaphysical ideas. But for me, it's in the context of just representing the classes, how people experience the world and represent it. So it's like an accounting of the fact that it exists in the experience of being human without making any ideological commitments about whether that matches an actual reality outside of ourselves. And that might sound kind of funny for me to say when I'm talking about, you know, arches and like universal pattern laws of nature. But remember, like for me, those can be grounded in like giving demonstrable examples. Whereas, you know, with metaphysical things, in some cases it can be, but in other cases, maybe not so much. So, and then what was the second question that you had?
Yeah, do you have a favorite unifying framework or theory?
I'm not in a position where I am allowed to have a favorite theory of everything framework. I think for that, I would say, I think that every theory of everything framework that I've seen, regardless of whatever truth value that I personally would append, I think that they're all valuable because they represent different people trying different ways of making sense of the world. And the way that we're going to get to understand, being able to go from theories into laws, into absolutes, we have to have a multiplicity of theories. We have to try different things out, different ways of making sense of things to find our ways to laws. And sometimes it looks crazy. Sometimes it does look crazy. It looks like whenever there's a paradigm shift, like someone has a new way of making sense of the world, and then people reject it because it's not part of the status quo. But then you get like 2-3 people dancing, and then the crowd comes, and then everyone starts dancing with them. And so like I have a tendency to, I don't place more value on frameworks that are more famous than others. I don't think that's a good measure. I think that one needs to like really just like bite into the framework, sort of treat it as though it could absolutely be true. Even if you don't know, just at least taking it as a lens and giving it the benefit of the doubt and following it as far as one can. Just trying it out, and then that lends to the notion of like, I'm less inclined, like I said, like on the Archmodern thing, I'm less inclined to want to poke holes in people's ideas. I want to see their frameworks get better, but I don't want to see people give up on their framework. Like if a framework is just wrong and then they just come to the conclusion, well, this can't be right. That's one thing. But like I said earlier, like usually like we get a lot of things right and we get some things wrong, and then everything's just iterative. Like it's approximations, like you have an idea and then you work it for a while, and then there's some parts of it that just don't quite work, and then you update it, you change it, you integrate new ideas and new experiences, and then sometimes it has a cascading effect on other ways we make sense of the world, but sometimes not. Sometimes other things stay really stable, and then you just get a new stable thing developed, and then together it becomes more stable. And then another thing I'll say is like in relation to this is that like arch theory doesn't replace unification meta-theories or even theories. It's like building blocks. Like architectonic simulation, like my personal arch theory, builds on other transdisciplinary frameworks. Like I named my 2 that I started with, but like it builds on other frameworks. So, from an archdisciplinary standpoint, we want unification meta-theories, like theories of everything, meta-theories, theories to be stable. Like we want them to be stable so we can build on them. So that's kind of like the framework that I sort of like organize my thinking around it. Not so much whether or not I like a framework, but what is its functional usefulness? Like what demographic can it fit? Like if I meet someone and they are interested in big picture thinking, maybe I can pull one out that hasn't got as much attention because it's like a really good fit for where that person's at and like how they're making sense of the world. It's less about having to have everything perfectly, absolutely true. And it's more about like going through the process in myself and with other people, and being able to take other people's perspectives as they're going through the process on their own. Because I do think that like the only way we're going to solve these big picture problems is if we find a way to work together to do it. And that means being okay with having differences and being okay with an error, like not sweating the small stuff, like, what is it? Like millions of kids are starving to death and people want to get into an argument about a framework that they could spend the same time applying it to real world political situations to resolve it. Like that's kind of like how I weigh things out.
Yeah, I'm really hearing this sense of educating and supporting people to become more rigorous, more efficient, more having this kind of checklist of arches to make sure that, all right, how does this fit in various different domains of my model? So yeah, there's a real sense. I guess for me, another thing you shared was in communicating with new people who may be interested in getting into theories of everything. Again, it kind of reminds me of approach to psychotherapy, where it's like a person-centered approach, where you're joining the person with their canopy of meaning and you're communicating to them wherever they're at. And that can obviously be done with different domains of knowledge. But there's also a sense, even the archers themselves, claiming them as necessary components, gives them this flavor of these universal absolutes, like these inherent structures that reality must follow. And if that's somewhat the case, then either we have kind of a relativism of possible interpretations of those arches, kind of like archetypes, and where there's different flavors of those arches, but it also seems to me to be a requirement that there's some specific way that the universe is in order for those arches to exist in the way that they exist. And in that sense, there's a one answer specific unifying theory that might emerge as well. And I'm curious to know if that's something you're interested in and kind of, or working on, or have seen glimpses of yet, or if you think that's sort of like a future endeavor that groups of people using this tool might come to.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of the ideas that you were discussing there. Like, I think along some of these similar lines. So first I would say, and then this is, in the book all over the place, arches are approximations. Like, the way that we're describing arches are approximations. So we write them as theorems with axioms and corollaries. They're numbered, so we can treat them in that fashion. So one can go and they can say, well, there's this theorem that's made out of these axioms, and there's this one axiom here, and I don't think that's right. Now we can get organized about locating specifically where a person doesn't agree in a larger system of organization about understanding universals. This is like the point of why it's organized that way, is it's putting into the world what we propose these arches are for conversation, for people to test them out in different domains and come back, and then we can have a conversation. And if we got something wrong, then let's update it. Let's fix the problem. And then in the third edition of Foundations of Archdisciplinarity at some future point, then we'll make those corrections. And then we'll write a note. Oh, well, we had these conversations and we realized that this thing was incorrect, and so we made this change. Now, in terms of like some sort of teleological end where we reach, absolute truth, arches are proposed universal laws. So it's the sense that we are between going from theory to law. And we have enough evidence to support them as a theory. And so there needs to be general consensus across different disciplines in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary spaces that they work, that they show up over and over again. And they can be used to help better organize our understanding of things, because it's the intrinsic template in which reality itself is organized. Now, so arch theories is like you have a person and then they take multiple theories of everything and then they relate them to each other and they systematize it. And in many cases, there's arches, like these universal patterns. They're like, well, these frameworks are all they're organizing along the same rules. And so I can now define what these rules are. So it's not just one theory of everything claiming that there is a rule, but now we see there are multiple individuals, multiple communities agreeing. So you get arch theories, which systematize theories of everything, or they're systematized in arches, or both. Okay. Eventually, we get multiple arch theories. So there's already a couple of them. I would say a few of them. And then there is the coordination of the relation between the arch theories towards a unification of arch theories. The thing about arches is that it is what Alan Turing was describing in his work, So in a system of logic based on ordinals, which is his PhD dissertation, he basically showed that so you have Gödel iterations, right? Like completeness and incompleteness, and then you get new axioms to explain what's going on, but then they can't explain themselves, and then you have to get more axioms. What he showed is that if you go high enough up in the hierarchy, eventually you get to a point where you get axioms that can explain all the axioms that came before, and then when you go up another rank, it goes with you. It stays. So you get this universal character. Primitive recursion was the one that Gödel and Klein and Turing and Church and others all agreed on. It's like recursivity. So you have a repeating process that's going on over and over and over again as you go up the hierarchy. This is a property that repeats. So the reason I'm saying all of this is because what makes arches really interesting is that they are embedded in the very evolutionary development of understanding. So they're going to continue to be present, or at least it's proposed that they'll continue to be present. So it becomes a matter of approximations getting higher and higher resolutions. So going from 480p to 8K of understanding what's going on. And, at different levels of pixelation, there's going to be certain images that we're going to misunderstand and think that there's something different. But eventually when you get a high enough resolution, eventually things get really crisp. So it's always really difficult to make a prediction of the future of what sociocultural evolutionary development is going to look like, what the evolution of our theories are going to look like, what we would name a new scope of inquiry, because we don't have anything to reflect on yet. And the way that we get there is by doing the work of the coordination. So that means that whether people are working on a theoretical level or a meta-theoretical level or unification meta-theoretical level or an arch-theoretical level, or want to push even beyond that, all of those, they are all equally valid. We need all of them. Theories, on the ground, concrete, real world things, then inform the meta theories, which informs arch theories. So there's it's the value to me is equally distributed. And I think that it's just going to be the same thing as in pre-modern times, people could not have possibly imagined archdisciplinarity. They're just missing the components. They couldn't see it. And I think that the process will probably keep going. There will be a time when, arch theory becomes a layer, and then another kind of higher order theory or disciplinary scope space emerges. But I don't know what it looks like. I don't know if that's for our species or we need another species in order to compare our total unification of knowledge to be able to get a comparison to say, oh, you share the same universal truths as us. I don't know what it looks like. We just speculate. And
perhaps your AGI you're building will be able to figure out.
It could be like creating new kind of sentient life, through machines, and then they have their own experience of the world, and then we relate to them, and then can find what we share in common in that way. The future will be interesting regardless of whatever it might be. Maybe it'll be all the above.
Yeah, super interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a real sense I'm getting of this new kind of science emerging through this project, kind of the science of archdisciplinarity, of figuring out the commonalities, and what you're saying about not holding or not grabbing onto too early a specific metaphysical framework that meets the requirements of the archdisciplinarity. Maybe someone out there has a pretty good stab at it, but there's a sense that the collective mind is better than any one individual in coming up with the truth of those things. That there is probably going to be a single truth, but and maybe the logos mythos framing kind of helps here. It's that whatever that logos, that single truth, will have many possible different flavors, many possible different ways into expression and understanding and experiencing of those truths.
There can be a kind of a relativism, right? It's that place where you have multiple ways of understanding the world, or different ways of knowing and doing. But I would say at this scale, like with theories of everything, multiple theories of everything, and then being able to hold the space, right? Like they all are kind of right, and they all kind of have some errors, but it's a transitional step in a larger series of increments. And eventually it's going to go to that systems place where, the two frameworks get collated and all of their interiors start to get related. And then everything gets worked out, like what they shared in common, what was different, why it's different, how you can maybe even resolve it. And then it gets fed back up into that larger collation. And so when I think about having a satisfiable worldview, but then being in that juncturing space, but then being in the collation space, well, eventually it's just going to arrive back at a satisfiability space, and then it's going to go through another juncturing. And so I think like the absolute relative sort of thing is a sort of like a leapfrogging. And every time we do that, we're just incrementing increasingly more accurate renditions of reality. Like a lot of people like to say that Gödel's theorems is like proof that we can't know what's true, but that's not what Gödel meant. That's not what he argued. Because when you create new axioms, you're creating an explanation. You're not discrediting what you're explaining. You have a new explanation. So you're adding more specificity. You're not losing anything. Maybe in some cases, like you find like a way of making sense of the world is just wrong. But in most cases, it's like, even if something is wrong, now it becomes a member. So now you know a way of making sense of things the wrong way that you can systematize with ways that do work. And I would say like with the spectrum of human imagination, that because like back then, this sort of has followed me here, because like back then it was about imagination. Like it doesn't matter like if you believe in unicorns, or that it doesn't matter if you believe in Jesus. It doesn't matter if you believe in Muhammad. It doesn't matter if you believe in Vishnu. Like it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is we have the capacity to imagine all of those things, right? And so it's more about, and this goes back to Rulliad. Like you just end up, I think, being able to hold the possibility space of all the different ways that things could be. And then if one doesn't know what the truth is, then you can sort of go forward with a multiplicity of perspectives and then just kind of like test out a belief. I mean, I just said like religious beings, but I don't mean just religious beings. I mean like with any particular way of interpreting the world. Like we can go forward without necessarily knowing what's true and then carry forward these ways that could potentially be true and then just be testing them all simultaneously, like in an intuitive way, if not in explicitly, in the weave kind of way.
Well, speaking of which, I'm curious, would you describe yourself as spiritual? And if you would, like, what would be the labels that you would apply to your spirituality or your worldview in that sense?
I'm going to give a political answer. Okay, so people will often sort of exaggerate a universal class as reality itself above other universal classes. So I'll give a couple of examples. So like people will take matter, the domain of matter, like the material universe, and then they'll exaggerate it as physicalism. And then everything falls under physicalism. Or some people will exaggerate in architectonic simulation, I call it apparatus, in a lot of other big picture, both transdisciplinary and archdisciplinary derived frameworks. People often call it things like life. In the domain, we'll just say life. people who exaggerate that as being the main domain of reality will believe in organicism, that the entire universe is a living organic being. I would say the same thing for like energy, or like the universal class of energy. So people will exaggerate that, and like from like a spiritual standpoint, then the entire universe will seem like the breath of God, that spirit is circulating through everything. And then it's underlying all the forms that crystallize into material reality. If you take like space, for example, which is like another universal class, people will see the Tao. They'll see like the eternal emptiness. That's the abode of all things, that all appearances. And that the true truth of reality is the emptiness, is the void, the darkness within darkness. We could say the same thing about like semiotic, like in architectonic simulation, semiotic is one of the universal classes. That's information universe. People see the universe is one big information system. Psyche, people believe in a panpsychism, that the entire universe is one big mind. And so when I look across these different ways, this is my political answer, which is, yes, I think that there's a spiritual part of me, but yes to all the other ones too. I think that there's probably something partially true about all of those. And reality is probably much weirder and much more profound than we have yet come to understand. And so not that I would want to get into a conversation here, but I've had some very strange experiences that do not fall into what can easily be scientifically explained. And so it leaves me open-minded, not open-minded to just kind of believe anything, but, open-minded to consider the possibilities of what could be true. And also when other people have experiences that lead them to believe in one thing or another, have, for example, spiritual experiences, I'm open to it. And then I treat it like it could actually, maybe it's actually true, like what they're saying. I don't know. So yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah. What you said about reality being stranger and more profound than we can really imagine, that resonates with me. And certainly, I've had experiences of my own that have that same quality of being sort of extraordinary in a way that is extremely difficult to fit into any kind of rational framework, and that kind of compel a sort of openness towards that strangeness, that ultimacy of the mystery of things. So yeah, I definitely am on the same wavelength about that.
Yeah. I'm left with endless curiosity. Those kinds of things. I don't know. One of the things, like, I don't consider myself a Jungian per se. I think he got a lot right, but like we're still updating our sense making. And so I think there's a lot of things from Jung we can probably update too. But like, one of the things that he said was that life hates a standstill. I don't know. Sometimes the unexplainable and the weird is kind of necessary to kind of shake things up and keep things moving. That would be my my safe interpretation.
I really like that too, and it kind of reminds me of Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey. Like there's this whisper on the wind, or the call to adventure, something that pulls us out of our known world and onto this magical world that just, the openness to taking that journey. Cory, you mentioned these different classes of which tend to be kind of reified or projected as ultimate truths in some sense. But and again, it feels like the archers are in some way pointing to all of those things being true but it's like we haven't found the core or the superclass that holds all of those, or like it's almost like all of those are expressions of something more fundamental, perhaps, or at least that's my interpretation of it. Do you agree with that? Like, do you feel like that we're trying to point to a kind of a universe out of which these arches are all inherently a part of, which makes our reality manifest in the various different ways of where these arches exist on these different levels?
So I think my answer would be something like, so taking arches in their relationships and in how they systematize. And I think for listeners, we haven't went through all the arches, and we haven't really, you both have looked at the book, but maybe the audience isn't entirely familiar. So maybe I'll just kind of like buzz through them a little bit and relate it to what we're talking about here. Like universal computability consists of like the recursivity of entities having relationships and forming systems. And then the systems become new entities, and then this repeats. There's complexity, which measures, it enumerates how many there. So complexity consists of like horizontal complexity, how many elements that exist at a particular level. Vertical complexity counts how many horizontal lines there are that are related in a sequence, which then relates to integrative levels. But I'll say with complexity, there's also diagonal. So you can have multiple levels of things, and then something that's happening on one layer can have an influence on something that's happening on another layer that's not directly related. And then with integrative levels, they consist of like, they can be nests, they can be stacked, or there can be vectors. So I suppose I would say stacks first is kind of like the horizontal complexity. So with stacks, you have like a stack of books. They're not like merging into each other. They're and while they're stacked, vertically, that's not what I mean there. I just mean stacked by things can be in relation to each other in a space in some sort of a sequence. And then, of course, nests is related to the vertical complexity, because nests, you have things that are contained within other things, which are contained within other things. So like our bodies are made out of organs, and then they're made out of organ systems made out of organs, made out of tissues, made out of cells, and so on. So there's this nesting of like anatomical units having animative relations and forming higher level of organization. So integrative levels is like that. And then permeative boundaries describes objectivity, subjectivity, and transjectivity. So objectivity says that you have like you have a boundary and you have an exteriority that separates from an interior space. And then, of course, the subjectivity is what's in that interior space. And then transjectivity is what holds across both. So transjective things I would describe as like time, space, and energy. Like the same time is happening right now in you and me. The same space is underneath you and me, or all three of us simultaneously, even though we're in different places, right? We're all made of the same energies, just taking different forms. And then with integrative levels, they tend to fall into like architectural and processual categories, like I described before. So that means that there'll be like structural building blocks, but there can also be processual building blocks of change. So a person can go through different stages of cognitive development on the same architectural building block, but we can make a distinction between those two different sets of levels, or two different sequences that go on. And then there's, of course, like a fractality. The arch of fractality describes qua and morphisms. So qua is like quality and quantity, which could be argued to be the same thing. But there's basically quantification is like the enumeration of something in general. And then a quality is the characteristic properties that you can't always enumerate. Like I was saying before, like the color blue, like can't just, you can represent it as a number in a computer, but like in our brains, it's like the experience is very different. But morphism in particular that's when you get a repetition of patterns. So you'll see the same pattern show up over and over again in a self-similar way. For example, like you take a piece of broccoli and you break off a branch, and then that branch is a little miniature broccoli. So you can do a measure on that quantitatively, but you can also do like qualitative measure as well, which is that. So like an example of this would be like I was saying before about anatomical units having animative relationships, which create a higher level of organization and building blocks of life. See, this would be a qualitative fractal. There's the same repeating procedure that's going on. Substances, forces, and configurations of matter. The configurations become new substances, and then the process repeats. This would be like a qualitative fractal. And then, of course, we have Rulliad and singularity. So Rulliad is the possibility space of any possible state in transformation that can happen in a system. And then singularity is like the other side of the coin, which says that it's the actual states and transformations that are going on in a system. So Rulliad accounts for all possible combinations and permutations that can happen in that system, whereas singularity is more about the general axis that consists of convergence points of where the most things are intersecting in a given system, such that changing one of those convergence points will have the greatest effect on the rest of the system. And so they're kind of two sides of the same coin, because you, in order to figure out, like with a high level of specificity, what the singularity system is, you need to be able to map it to the possibility space to understand the possible relationships that things can have, so you can make predictions. So taking all of the arch system together, so taking all those arches, they're all related to each other, right? Like integrative levels are made up of bounded fractal computational repetitions. And then they take a variety of different variations of expression, but they are always exhibiting the same characteristics over and over and over again. So whether we look at, like life with anatomical units having animative relations in higher levels of organization, or like I said, with matter, with substances, forces, and configurations, or with semiotics, talking about semantics, syntactics, and pragmatics, or in our psyches, having faculties that mentate together into more complex forms of interfacing. They're all repeating the same archetypal patterns, these arches. They are present at every level of the system across domains. To get to your question, the thing about arches is that they're self-referential. So every time you go down a building block, you get a repetition of the arch's presence. And then so like, for example, you go, okay, we have a system, we're going to break it down into its relations, and then we're going to break the relations into their entities. And then each entity, then you break that entity down into, because it's its own system. Each entity is its own system composed of its relations of smaller entities. And you can take those, you can break those things down. Similarly, you have, a repetition of integrative levels, a repetition of boundary spaces, repetition of just a fractality in general of the arches. And so we ask this question, like, well, what's underneath the arches? Like, what is their derivative? Every time we go down a level empirically to try to get to like the bottom of what's going on, it's just another repetition. And so I don't have an answer to this question as for, where they all fundamentally derive. All I know is that they seem to repeat over and over again, and every possible variation that they seem to be able to, they find some way to do it based on the initial conditions of, complex systems. I mean, we can like do a generalization and say something like in architectonic simulation, I have a class called the universal prototype, and the universal prototype, I didn't derive it from any big picture framework. It was just sort of like looking at my own framework and then seeing this repeating pattern. And basically, the universal prototype says that there's always going to be a domain, There's going to be modalities of that domain, and then it's going to tessellate. And that is kind of like a content-free way of talking about universal computability, where the domain is recursion, the modalities is static, dynamic, multidynamic, or entities, relations, and systems. And then the tessellation is the recursion, like it just repeats back on itself over and over and over again in every possible variation. And then it creates all the various things. But, that's could just be me having a generalization. But if there was some truth to it, that would mean that there could be other universes that have different domains with different modalities and different ways they tessellate. But then we're sort of like carrying something over from one space to the other. And, could there be another way of organizing it? But at least for this universe, I think arches are on the right track to getting to kind of universal laws that underpin our natural laws. Maybe they're not entirely accurate, but I think they're approximated pretty close, is what my personal opinion would be. But of course, I'm like one of the people talking about it, so of course I would say that. But
one of the outcomes of this Archdisciplinary research project is that the universe, whatever its non-contingent ground of being is, the structure of it has to allow for these arches to either be inherent in that structure or kind of emerge out of some more basic rules if we find that that's the case.
Well, I would actually like to say one more thing about this. The example that I've thought about the most in relation to this question, which is like, okay, so I was saying entity relation systems, but like let's get more specific here. So the terms I like to use is static, dynamic, multidynamic. So static basically means equilibrium or something extraordinarily low entropy enough that it's able to maintain its state. So it's persisting across time. Okay, so you have an equilibrium, and that equilibrium is made of a system of relations. And the n area can be 2, but it can be 3, 4, 5. It could be as many as it might be. But there's actions that are taking place. There's dynamic motion, and that those dynamic motions across those relationships are enabling that equilibrium to maintain itself. And that those dynamic relations are made of entities. They're made of static equilibriums that are moving and doing things in relation to others. So now we're back to where we started. Okay, so that means that the definition of equilibrium needs to evoke dynamic relations between staticisms, which just brings us back. So it's like what another reality would be like without equilibrium, without things being at rest. Like, what would that even be? I can't even imagine it, because the capacity for me to imagine it requires me to be able to maintain an equilibrium of a conception. So it raises the question if any given reality would necessarily need to rely on arches in order for it to exist at all. And to that, I don't have an answer, because there's no other universe in which to make reference. Maybe somebody will get clever and they'll be able to simulate something, but that'll be a problem because integrated circuits are based on the same static, dynamic, multidynamic triplication, which is called variables, operations, and functions. So I don't know. It's a really interesting question with which I have no answer, and I'm kind of okay with that.
And Sink and I, we both have our own preferred metaphysical theories of everything. Mine in particular also has that kind of static dynamic balance at zero. It's tricky because to talk about this stuff and to convince anyone, you have to have some level of, explicit, rigorous, logical steps or like some pathway down to talk about it. And your archdisciplinary approach is doing something different in its attempt to make a science of it. It's not one person trying to be like, hey, look, here's this rigorous rationale down to my particular way of thinking about things. It's more like, here's the science that we can all say, look, here's something that we like, at least as a framework without any specific language around it yet. But yeah, it's kind of exciting. And it's also, I guess, related to this channel in itself. What it is, and the intention behind it is an educational platform where we can come to more specific truths around the contention between our specific theories of everything and other theories and everything. So yeah, I think that your project is definitely going to be a massive aid in and speed boost for that. So I'm excited to kind of have more conversations with you, hopefully, and with InSync definitely around reflections on this talk and ongoing research and updating our ways of thinking.
Yeah, I kind of see like this Foundations of Archdisciplinarity book is sort of like being like a sort of like a Git branch point, like where like people can create different branches of understanding, and then we can all just sort of like loop back to each other at some point and sort of like, the leaves in well, I'll just stick to my metaphor I was saying before. It's just like everything just kind of loops back and then everybody informs everybody else. And then we all sort of like update our own sense making. And it's like, okay for people to disagree, because like eventually there will be some point, presumably, where if we go far enough or we wait long enough, eventually we'll find some way to fit our ideas together in some way. And so, yeah, like I'm all about like archdisciplinarity and arch theory and archmodernism. It's sort of like putting terms in the world that acts as a language that helps people communicate, but keeping it flexible enough that people can think about it in new ways that I would never think about it, that can inform, myself and other people who are working in the space. So I guess just what I'm trying to say is, I'm a big fan of diversification, and yeah, just people looping back and then, comparing their outcomes from trying different things, as opposed to, the ceaseless headbutting. It's not fun. It's not fun to headbutt. Some people like it, but it's not really my thing.
Yeah. That even though people headbutt around the specifics, I feel like maybe not everyone has this intention, but there's some commonality between us that is, and pointing back to something you said earlier, it's like, well, the world is pretty fucked up right now, and rather than being armchair philosophers just arguing about these specifics, we need to remember why we're doing this stuff. Like there's a potential for unification and sense making and unification of models that hopefully will support like there's a meta-modern spirituality group that's kind of like bringing people together from different religious backgrounds and helping people find commonality in meaning making in a spiritual sense. And I think that project's super important as well. But there's something about the foundations of thinking that we're talking about now that allow for multiplicities of different spirituality or sense-making thinking to come together and work together, like kind of like, okay, let's put all this other stuff aside because we've got this common ground now, and let's help make the world a better place and fix all these huge issues that we're really desperate to fix.
Yeah.
No, what was just said kind of reminds me of a great quote, which I think is a good place to start to wrap up, which is the man who agrees with us that some question little regarded by others is of great importance can be our friend. He need not agree with us about the answer.
Yeah. And like nature, like when things are successful, it's because there's like a higher level of coordination. Like societies thrive when people work together. So it's like it's built into our bodies. Like at every single level of our bodies, all the parts of our bodies are working together to maintain homeostasis so the next level can do its thing and have homeostasis. So when I think to the future, I think these kinds of conversations, the conversations you two have, proposed to be having in the future beyond this, I think this is the path to get there, is like we have to go through the multiple entities, having relationships and forming a higher level system. And the only way we can do that is if there's multiple people in the space who have different ideas. If there's no difference, then there's no basis to make any kind of distinction. So, and then everyone just homogenates, and then we go nowhere. So, yeah, I'm in agreement with all of that, with what you both said.
It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, Cory. Yeah, I'd be really, I'm really excited to see, the evolution of your project and the ongoing releases. You just announced the encyclopedia. Would you like to say a little bit about that before we wrap up? Because I know it's like kind of the new thing you just announced.
So the Archdisciplinary Research Center and the Institute of Applied Metatheory are working together to create an encyclopedia of big pictures. We have Rob Smith and Josh Leonard of the Institute of Applied Metatheory. Rob Smith has been CEO of, I think, the Integral Life, or the Integral folks. And Josh Leonard, they work jointly together, like in IM, Institute of Applied Metatheory. And then on our side, we have myself and Nick Hedlund and Brendan Graham Dempsey and Michael Kleinberg. And then we're going to be working as editors, basically management editors for the journal. And so we'll be having, inviting dozens of scholars to write articles about big picture frameworks, about their own frameworks. Scholars who have expertise in a specific framework to be writing articles so we can make sure we get really good, high level, high quality work in the encyclopedia. And it's going to be free to the public. And I don't know when this is going up, but we'll probably be running a fundraiser for it. IM provided ARC a grant for our side to work on it. But they'll carry us for a while. We'll still run a fundraiser, and we'll have some tier benefits for people who would like to contribute financially to what we're doing. So we'll be making another public announcement about that in the next week, probably. So, but yeah, it's exciting. It's a dream come true for me to work on. Truly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool. What by the time this thing airs, we'll have some links in the description for anyone interested. Hopefully all that stuff will probably be available in various different forms. Yeah, we'll get them down. But thanks again, Cory. Thanks, NSYNC, and I'll see you guys another time.
Yep. Take care.